looking at the latest postponements, you'd assume that COVID was sweeping through a lot of teams and that there was lots of players who had the disease. The impression that we get is it kind of creeped into a lot of camps, record high number of cases, 103 positive cases in the last round. But there's a bit of mystery around it because it's unclear as to whether those are playing staff or just players. We put it to our Twitter poll recently, asking people if there has been, problems with the reporting of it and if people think that there needs to be more transparency. And 81% of the 2,048 voters who did vote on that Twitter poll said, yes, better transparency is needed. And we're not alone here. David Moyes has said himself, I don't think he's accusing anybody of this, but he has asked the question, just like we are. He said, we've got injuries, but I hope nobody is getting their games called off for injuries because we would have called a few of ours off if that were the case. I can't speak for other clubs. So, Ben, we've got COVID fixture postponements, but is this actually true? Do you think that they are being called off because of COVID?
I think there's a media narrative, or certainly there's a push towards this COVID fixture postponement. Well, in actual fact, it isn't. It's part of the issue. It does impact on player availability, but it's not the be all and the end all. It is about, like I say, coming down to squad numbers, which are being impacted by players testing positive. But it's not solely that. And the reason that we decided to bring this topic up today, and I felt as if I was in a position to comment as an impartial and as a supporter of Newcastle United, because ours has been the latest game to be called off by the Premier League. Of course, we were due to play Everton on Thursday evening, having just picked up that point against Manchester United, a game which, in matter of fact, we picked up injuries to key players. Now, Alan Saint-Maxim almost certain to miss out the game. Callum Wilson, our club's leading scorer, looks as if he's going to be spending a lengthy spell on the sidelines. So this game, purely from a supporter's standpoint, as a Geordie, this was a welcome relief because I was looking ahead of that game, which is a big game for us. We need the points. That was a concern as to who we would get out and what kind of squad we would take down to Goodison Park. However, the worker in me, the one that wants to look at that impartially and consider the ramifications of that decision, didn't sit quite well. And again, it maybe led me to sort of question what my beliefs around this COVID situation were, and whether in the fact that, what is the process? Are clubs being dealt with, on an even playing field? And ultimately, how are these yes-no decisions being taken and being made?
Let's turn it as well to Crystal Palace. This was a team that wanted their game postponed. And just quickly, Ben, how many players did they actually change in their team when they wanted that game postponed due to COVID?
One, and that one player was Mark Guy, who dropped down to the bench. So I think it was Joshua Anderson actually came into that Crystal Palace back four. So in terms of the starting 11, there was one change. And there had been a lot of talk over Christmas Day that this game against Tottenham was going to be postponed because of a COVID outbreak. And that naturally then leads to this amount of skepticism around, again, the process in our clubs, maybe just pushing the boundaries of gamesmanship, maybe, or, hiding behind the cover of COVID because of this busy schedule, and maybe the one or two cases that they have, and maybe the one or two injuries that they've also picked up.
Well, this is the interesting thing, and this is what you put in the Twitter poll. The wording was, are clubs using it to their advantage? And just quickly to kind of review the rules for people, teams need to be able to have 13 squad players and a goalkeeper as minimum. And the rules are ambiguous enough that they have to play players from their under 21s, under 18s, whatever, with relevant experience. So, I mean, the first question to you, Ben, is what is the point of having a Premier League 2 team? Because a lot of these teams are going into these matches saying, well, we've got too many COVID cases coupled up with our injury situation, and therefore we can't field the first 11 when they do have a backlog of really good youngsters that they're always bigging up, saying, well, they're on the cusp of playing in the Premier League, but then they're not given the opportunity.
I mean, exactly that, Jason. And again, it begs a couple of questions to myself. And I look at my hometown club, Newcastle, and I had a quick look at maybe which members of those under 21 players are in a position to maybe step up. And, over the last couple of seasons or last season and a half, maybe Elliot Anderson is one of the only ones that's had Premier League experience. The problem is with this Premier League guide handbook is relevant experience. There's a bit of a grey area. There's a little bit of a space there for Premier League clubs to hide behind. And, in the truest sense, Newcastle can say, well, we've only had one player from the under-23s, from our academy team, playing in the first team, over the last season and a half. What's the point in having your under-23s? What's the point in funding this? Where is that step up? Where is that gap? Or the cynic in me could then also say, well, actually, knowing that this was part of the Premier League directive from going back to Project Restart, are clubs then knowingly not promoting players from their second tier side because they know that, inevitably they're not going to be as good or at a level of those within the first team. And therefore, if these players have experience, then the Premier League will make a ruling and a decision based on the fact that they have X number of players who have been in that first team, who could step up and therefore will play, and the fixtures must go ahead.
I mean, really interestingly, watching the festive fixtures and certain teams, and it kind of brought it home chatting to my gran. She loves watching the football with me, and she made this offhand comment, but kind of recording this, talking to you beforehand, it seemed to actually be really relevant. She goes, oh, isn't it fantastic at the moment that there's a lot of teams giving a lot of youngsters opportunities? And you kind of saw this with Norwich, fielding a back four that they hadn't ever done so before because of the situation that they find themselves in. But also the age of a Leeds player specifically took out Ben. I mean, do you want to talk about that one? A 15-year-old playing.
Yeah, I mean, Archie Gray named on the Leeds bench against Arsenal, heavily depleted time, but 15 years of age. You could argue, that Marcelo Bielsa, they had their problems. That game went ahead. They weren't hiding behind anything. Everton, they travelled to Stamford Bridge, to Chelsea. They had Lewis Dobbin, who came in off the bench, and Ellis Sims making his full debut. They also included the likes of Branthwaite in their team, John Joe Kenny, who hadn't had a lot of experience in and around that team as well. I know Gordon has had he's been more of a prominent role in the team, but he's still a very young player, and it was heavily depleted, but they got a team out. They promoted those players from the academy team to get that, fulfill that fixture. And it seems to me that maybe some clubs are, again, using that situation, choosing not to promote from within and just calling for those games to maybe, be rescheduled or postponed to a time which is maybe more beneficial to them.
And the interesting thing as well is certain clubs might actually be punished in a roundabout way for fielding their first 11. It's almost disincentivized to keep to the fixture.
Yeah, I mean, following on from that Twitter poll that we had, and I've had lots of comments with regards to posts over the last 24 hours from the moment that Newcastle game was postponed. And I questioned this. And normally when you put a lot of things out on Twitter, you can please some people, some of the time, but you can't please all people all of the time. And I expected a little bit of kickback. I expected some fellow Geordies to say, shut your mouth. We've got the game called off. Of course, it shouldn't have went ahead. We've got X number of players sidelined. But generally, everybody who decided to comment on some of those posts were in total agreement that they didn't believe that these games should be called off and that the academy teams should be promoted within, and clubs should be utilising the full strength and depth of their playing staff.
I mean, this kind of goes back. We talked about this with Raja a week or two ago. Arsenal at the start of the season almost seemed to have unfairly punished because they had maybe as many, if not more, COVID cases than a lot of clubs who are calling games off at the moment. And they were, I don't know whether they were forced, but the fixtures went ahead. The club had some embarrassing results due to maybe not being able to field their first 11. And it does make you question where the transparency is, going back to that Twitter poll. And just kind of to read the rules, page, is it 289 of the Premier League handbook this season? Rule 5 states, in terms of the games being called off, that there's such ambiguous language. The board believes that it would be extremely difficult to realistically apply and enforce any sort of subjective weighting against the level of a player who may become unavailable for whatever reason. It's fascinating that these rules that are governing whether games go ahead, millions of pounds, fans going to matches, it has such ambiguity to it. And then there's the next one. Clubs have to make an appeal to this situation for a game to be called off as reasonably practicable. Those are the words there. And we saw 2 hours before people coming from Watford up to Burnley, and all of a sudden their game is cancelled. A lot of people were in transit, spent a lot of money to be able to go to that game, bought tickets, whatever, took time off work, and all of a sudden that is a so-called practicable time. So just to kind of maybe summarize it up though, Ben, is this a problem with more of the league than the club? So, the old saying, don't hate the players, hate the game. This seems to be a situation where it is the rules that are the problem, and the rules maybe aren't not being enforced properly because they just seem so ambiguous, don't they?
My point was going to be, the rules are there. They're just not being enforced adequately and appropriately. I was going to touch upon, a comment that I did receive, and it wasn't against necessarily in total disagreement, but they try to offer a rationale into the thinking behind why some games may be called off and why others have been allowed to proceed. And one of the arguments that they sort of levied towards that was, well, just because somebody comes out of isolation, it doesn't mean that that player is instantly 100% fit and available. This Premier League handbook does not differentiate between a player that is maybe 50% match fit or 100% match ready. It's you're available or you're not. So if you're coming back off COVID after your period, you are available now. And that's the same as, for example, Rafa Benitez was considering, had the game not been called off, but he would have been forced into playing Dominic Calvert-Lewin, spent close to 4 months on the sideline with injury, with at least 2 setbacks that we were aware of. Now, he was talking about maybe forcing that player not only to start, but he was talking in excess of 60, 70, 80 minutes because he just didn't have other players at his disposal. There were 9 first-team senior players available at that time, plus 2 goalkeepers. Before his appeal was then heard by the Premier League, and it was good. So, it's the problem for me. It's got to come from the Premier League, because as supporters, as followers, as people who are working within the industry, they haven't got that level of transparency. There's not that full understanding about which games get called off and why some go ahead. There doesn't seem to be any definitive guide in terms of, look, we have this 13 plus 1. As long as you've got 13 first-team players with experience plus your 1. Reality of this 13 plus 1. As long as you've got 13 first-team players with experience plus your 1. Reality, what does that mean? Surely every member of playing staff within that club should be of a level where they could come in and at least fulfill a requirement of 1 game. Now that puts at your disposal in and around 35 to 45 players, depending on the club. Now, nobody anywhere that I'm aware of, and I've been tracking this for a long time, no club at any time has listed more than 20 players on the sidelines at any one time over any season. What I have seen previously, I've seen teams, I think Norwich on an occasion when they were last in the Premier League, they had 15 or 16 players sidelined. I've had teams with 12 and 13 absences. Never, ever, to my knowledge, have any of those fixtures been requested to be postponed, or, they certainly have went ahead as planned. So what changes now? Is it COVID, or is there a change in the landscape? Is there a move? Is it because of the time of the year? Is it an understanding that maybe, player well-being? I don't know, but like I say, it's this uncertainty, these number of unknowns that are creating this skepticism among, people within the game to maybe questioning the motives of, one, the clubs, and maybe secondly, the Premier League with regards to the decisions around these games.
So Ben, just maybe going back into a bit of Premier League history here, going into the deep delves of my brain here, but I remember an incident back in 1996 with Middlesbrough, and I've kind of looked into it for us at the situation, and it backs up what you're saying about historically teams have had 15, 16 players out due to injuries, 12, 13, whatever, and they didn't have games called off, even though they were in a seriously weakened position out of their control. Injuries are not something self-inflicted. And so what happened in December 1996, all that time ago, around this time of year as well, Middlesbrough had an outbreak of illness at the club, and they wanted to call off a game with Blackburn Rovers with less than 24 hours notice. The club actually claimed at the time that 23 players were out with sickness, injury, or suspended, giving them little or no chance of success in what was already a relegation battle. We call them the 6 pointers because they're so important to those teams. At the time, the FA did not agree with the Middlesbrough team, and the Middlesbrough team were not actually able to field the team. And so not only were they, taken away the ability to have that game rescheduled, postponed, whatever, but they were actually given a 3-point deduction. And it proved to be very, very vital in the history of that club, because at the end of the season, Middlesbrough went down 2 points shy of safety and had a better goal difference than those above them. Those 3 points would have made all the difference. So it is quite interesting how we've gone from a no tolerance situation of you have to deal with this situation, you have to do it yourself. And now all of a sudden it is very ambiguous as to when COVID is calling off these games, Ben. I mean, it is fascinating kind of looking at Premier League history as well, isn't it?
Yeah, and for me, like I say, when we had COVID and it was the COVID fixture postponements, that was a definitive answer. You submitted your lateral flow, you then followed that up with a PCR test, that went to your club doctor, then the club relayed that information to the Premier League, and you said, okay, we have X number of positive cases, therefore we cannot field a team. That's fine. We're now stepping into the realms of, well, actually, again, it's a little bit of gamesmanship there. I look at Newcastle. We had Fabian Shaw, who was feeling his hamstring on Monday evening against Manchester United. Was it a touch of cramp, or have the club reported that as a hamstring injury? We've seen Ryan Fraser go off, hamstring niggle. Didn't look anything too serious. Looked all right. Could he have played? Could he have not? We don't know. There are no independent medical assessments. We've seen the issues. How many times we talked about, concussion protocol and clubs making decisions on behalf of players, deeming whether the player is fit to maybe continue, and the need for that independent assessment to determine a player's fitness. Is that now where we're going with clubs? Because who's to say now, because it's availability and it's not just COVID, we've got a couple of COVID cases. Yes, we've got 9 or 10 injuries. Who really, at this point in time, there's so much money now within the Premier League and teams retaining their top flight status, then sides, managers, coaches, They're going to use everything within their power to maybe push the boundaries of their rules and regulations within the game to maximize their opportunities of hopefully getting that win, because it's such small margins. For Newcastle, we could be playing Everton when, one, we've got a squad that looks a lot fitter and healthier, but also we have the January transfer window coming along. We'll also have a period of rest where players don't have that level of load in their legs, so we're going to be fresher. Gives us more of an opportunity, hopefully, of picking up points. It's going to be difficult, and I'm not saying there's any perfect answer, but really, this question around player availability and squad numbers, and it not just being about COVID now, definitely muddies the waters.
So really, it brings me back to my point that I said earlier. It does seem like the game hasn't adapted to the situation, and if teams are doing what maybe we are describing, we're not putting accusations out there, but we are describing a possible situation. So for now, maybe the concluding thing is from you, Ben, this isn't COVID alone. This is COVID plus injuries, and you think that is unfair.
In short, I think it needs to be regulated. I think it's going to be very difficult to monitor. With COVID, at least you had that definitive answer in a way, or as definitive as it could be. And if it's not just down to COVID, then look, you suck it up and you go into that under 23 squad and you utilize some of that young talent that you have on your books, because otherwise, what is the point of having those members of playing staff, there if they're never going to be called upon?
Well, there you go. I hope people found this quite interesting. Maybe a slightly different style, going in depth and an opinion piece, because we just wanted to kind of highlight the situation, because it is not clear for a lot of people in the community. A lot of people around the Premier League are unsure why these games are being called off. It is assumed that it is just because of COVID. But as we've explained, the ambiguity around the rules means that it might not be just because of that. So please do remember to subscribe to the channel. We've got so much good content coming out here at the moment. At the moment as well, there is ever-changing situations with COVID, with injuries. So this is the best place to stay ahead of all that news as well, so that you can best make your decisions, whether you're betting on the Premier League, whether you are playing fantasy Premier League, whatever you're doing around that, we can help you with your decisions. But for now, I hope you have a happy and healthy new year, and we will see you again very soon.